Great. Hi. Welcome to this month's ICTBC. It is January, and so we are discussing a local author for Kansas Day. Oh, I should probably say that because it's going to be Kansas Day. So we have Jason Quinn Malott.
Yep.
Great. Wonderful. We're just going to call him Jason, though, because that's easier. And we're going to discuss his book, The Evolution of Shadows. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm librarian Sarah, by the way.
I'm librarian Racine.
We're all mixed up, but that's okay. So for those of you who maybe need a little refresher on the book, this story follows a group of friends. Well, they're not really friends. They're more acquaintances. They know each other, and they're all brought together by a charismatic photojournalist, Gray Bannock. And it's 1995 in the middle of the Bosnian War. I'm just going to read this because this is a lot better than probably me trying to fumble through it. So it's 5 years later, and Gray was lost in the middle of the war zone, and the friends have come together back to Sarajevo to search for him, find his remains, find out what happened to him, because they're just not sure. They need that closure. And they're brought together each by a different form of love that Gray kind of showed them what it means. I mean, he showed them in his own way what it means to love. The friend, the father figure, and the love interest. And so it's a very haunting story.
I didn't think, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's great.
Oh, no,
Well,
you didn't?
and I mean,
I thought that's, well, there we
Okay.
go. But yes. So anyway, it follows their story, and the timeline goes back and forth, and it's a very hauntingly beautiful, but really also horrific. I mean, like, it's a very much a war story, but it's also a love story. So anyway, let's jump in and talk about it.
well, and it's so different than what you would, sorry, I shouldn't say a Kansas writer and pigeonhole you that in such a fashion, but I mean, how did you get the idea for this book? Because I think I think of it as worlds removed from what our experience might be here in the middle of America.
Yes, I had the same question.
Well, I became interested in the war in Bosnia around the time that it was winding down in 94, 95. The news media was constantly telling us that it was this confusing three-way civil war between the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Muslims, and the Bosnian Croats, and we just needed to stay out of it and not get involved. And I thought, well, that's a little not right. And so I started reading about the war to try and understand it for myself, what was going on, and I became fascinated by it, partly because it was the first instance of, I guess the new PC term is ethnic cleansing, but was good old-fashioned genocide.
Yeah,
that hadn't
I
been
had no idea. I feel like that makes me a very naive Kansas girl, but I really had no idea. You hear about the Bosnian War, but it's really just a term. It's a two-word term, and it happened. But this was way beyond anything that I could even knew was going on in the world. So, please, sorry.
No, that's fine. And so it stuck in my head for years, and I ended up later in graduate school becoming interested in telling a story that was completely unrelated about two characters that were sort of stand-ins for me and a young woman I had a crush on at my day job, trying to follow Hemingway's advice that if you want to get rid of something, write about it. So I was writing this story to explain to myself why this relationship would never work out with this young woman. And my workshop class said, you have to follow these characters, they're fascinating. And as I started exploring the characters, trying to figure out more about who they were, all of that stuff that I'd read for 6, 7 years about Bosnia just flooded into the thing, and suddenly I had this thing, and I didn't know what to do with it except go until it was over.
Well, and sorry, my last name is Zakula. I'm a quarter Serb. And so when I opened your book and started reading about it, about the man who goes into the house, and there are the ghosts, and the ghosts, and the ghosts, I heard a story. My grandpa came over in 1911, and his mother wouldn't come over because she had 6 children buried. in the homeland. And there's been
Yeah.
conflict and strife in that area for so many, it's centuries. And the fact that she wouldn't leave her children, it was such a touching story to me that it was like, that's when your book instantly hooked me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly, and I think you really nailed it when you said that this had a dreamlike quality or a post. It was almost like PTSD filter on it. Is that?
I called it, I said shell shocked.
Shell shocked.
That the whole, the narration, each of the characters in their own way, from their losses, their lives, all of the things that they've gone through in the course of the story, they all had a shell shocked quality about them. And I kind of wondered if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that, and was that your intent? Was that, is there something about that story maybe that you felt shell-shocked by and that you brought to the story? Does that make sense?
Well, for me, I guess, never having, been in a situation like that, what often engaged me with it was just simply trying to explore a capacity for empathy. And also because I'd read a lot of books about the war, a lot of personal narratives by survivors from the Srebrenica massacre, from photojournalists who had covered the war, and how there was a certain shocking quality to it that had not been seen since World War II, at least on the European continent. We'd seen it in other areas of the world where there was conflict, but to me there was, if the shell shock came into it, it was simply because that was the truth for a lot of people who experienced the war. And what I was simply trying to do was to see if I could understand it, understand why it had such an impact on people, why it was at times ignored by governments and civilizations that had once stood up at Nuremberg and said, we'll never let something like this happen again. And the minute it did, they just said, oh, it's too confusing. I'm not going to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Well, it definitely is something that I find myself completely unfamiliar with, and I want to go research it and see things, or not see things, because I don't really need to see things like the pictures that they took.
No.
Oh my gosh, like they were taking, there was this scene of rape, and just Gray is there, and he has to document it, or he'll be shot by the people that are perpetrating it, and it's just, like, I almost had to skip it. I mean, I read it because it very quickly moved past, but it was just horrifying. So good job as a writer, because
well, and I mean,
it gave me feelings.
What higher praise can you give an author if, you've touched me, or this resonated, or this, and we were talking earlier about filters.
Mm-hmm.
And, a book is how people connect, right?
It's a conduit. A lot of writers are taught as a conduit between minds. I've had this story, these images, these thoughts, these daydreams or nightmares or daymares, whatever you wanted to call them, having read those experiences that I did, and being a person who, writers and readers and everyone, even if they're not writers or readers, has this capacity for empathy. And if you're able to engage it, you can put that on the page, then you end up creating an understanding. You're testing a boundary, and you get that out into the world and put that in between two covers, and you have this. It's the closest we get to a mind meld, is reading something that someone else has created. And there have been studies and things like this. There was David Gottschalk wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal, which was taking a look at how brain scientists have been studying the brain in relation to fiction.
I think I've heard of this.
Is this where the fiction readers are more empathetic people?
Yes.
So where that's
Probably,
from?
yeah.
Which is,
Our,
we talk about it a lot.
our brains don't know the difference between fantasy and reality. We determine that in our consciousness, but if you read about an event or experience an event, the exact same sections of the brain are activated. So if you have a story that attempts to be true to human experience, even though it's made up, it allows you to engage your own and the reader's empathetic imagination. And that's
That's a
where
cool,
literature-
well, and with literature, we also get the whole, how am I feeling that day? How am I feeling that month, that year? What events have happened that will influence why I read this book the way I'm reading it? Maybe, it's like, this wasn't the time for you to read this book. In 5 years, you read this book. Oh my gosh, this is really, that part of me was really latches onto that part of it. Those kinds of
college,
things.
when I read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, like, really matched up with my, like, angsty, 19-year-old self. It did.
Yeah.
But I also, if you don't mind, I would like to talk about Leanne.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Leon?
Either way,
Okay.
I've heard it pronounced both ways from people who actually.
What
know
is
the
your
origin of the word.
preferred?
I always pronounced it Leon.
Leon. Okay, that's what we're gonna go with. So I didn't like her. So there's this whole chapter on Leon, and I think we're supposed to maybe feel that empathy for what she's going through, and she's got the pressure from her parents to marry a Chinese boy, but she's got these feelings of love, and she's got this jealousy for her sister who's able to just eschew all of the what's the word?
Familial
The obligations, yes. These expectations of her, and Leon is not able to do so. So that's where we get this conflict with Gray and Daniel, and everything that's going on inside of her. But I wanted her to have more of a backbone because I was just like, come on, girl, like get it together. Like I get that you've got these things, but you're I don't know, you deserve to have whatever you want. And so anyway, I didn't really like her.
Okay.
And I wondered how you felt about her, like having written her. You said that maybe it was this, she was her
Mhm.
beginnings came from an unrequited crush. Can you talk about that?
Well, I guess.
Do you have
That-
specific
I
feelings
suppose-
regarding her? Like now,
Has she changed over
much
the
later?
years for
Yeah,
you?
there you
I
go.
think, well, since I haven't really gone back and read the book since I finished writing it, she's kind of always been there.
Yeah.
But, I guess the diplomatic answer a lot of writers will give is, I like all of my characters, or they're all important.
I don't think you have to like all of the characters that you
No,
write.
I
don't think that would be.
Well, and I would think that too, it's
You don't have to like everybody.
you would outgrow, or
That's true.
it's
Evolve with
you
time.
had that experience, and that experience was good, bad, or neutral, and then you go on to your next experience, or sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth. But I figured
It's okay.
that's
Librarian.
I am
like-
answering for him. Okay.
You got librarian.
I've got the
Okay.
library. No, and I think, whereas I thought that she was so full of secrets,
Yeah.
and she was still trying to figure things out in her life,
And that's
and
fair.
being pushed in a certain way, it makes it hard to have a backbone, to stand up to your parents, to stand up to what others think you should be doing. These are people that you love. How are you going to tell them no?
Well, her sister did. I mean, I don't know. I
Well-
think that she, as a result of falling in line with her parents, she lived however many years her and Daniel were married in this just like state of complete unhappiness, where it's like showing on her face. She's just, I don't know. I mean, shell shocked, right? So what? Go ahead. Did you have a moment of clarity?
Sorry, what if Leanne wants, she's miserable in the marriage, she gets out of the marriage, she's still miserable.
Spoiler.
What if sorry, spoiler.
We gave up on those long time ago.
What if she's just a miserable person?
Oh, and that's possible.
What if nothing is really going to make her happy until she finds that own universal inner peace kind of a thing?
Girl needs to go do some meditation on that.
Yeah,
Maybe.
maybe.
How are we doing on time?
Oh, we've got,
We're getting there.
yeah.
We're doing okay? Do we have any comments?
No.
Okay. Hey, we didn't mention it earlier because we got so excited about this conversation. But if you have comments or you have thoughts and you've read this book, or maybe you have thoughts on the subject matters, maybe you have thoughts on Leon, who knows? Please put them in the comments, and even if you're doing that after the fact, we will write back to you and we'll keep this conversation going. So anyway, back in.
Real quick, I
Yeah.
have a part. There's a paragraph that resonates with me, and it's about connections with fathers. But it kind of goes on beyond that. And
Okay.
he says, he wished he could have known his father better. What he knew about his father's war he had gotten from books and television documentaries from Hollywood. His father had never spoken directly of the war, and when he had died, there'd been only a footlocker packed with old uniforms and a few medals. And there were photographs in here as well. Every photograph made him wonder what it was like to fight a war against someone who, stripped of his uniform, would never give himself away as different until he spoke. I like that. Well, I mean, that's a brilliant thought. And two, it's almost like a metaphor for the father relationship. And, you kind of explore different ways of people relating. I mean, was that a part that stood out for you, that as like a theme of this, or how we relate to each other, or?
That is kind of how we relate to others, is why we fall in love, why we have wars, why we are ambivalent. And like a lot of first novels, it touches on a little bit of everything that I'm perpetually obsessed with, and so that's, I guess, part of the beauty and the flaws in a lot of first novels. You see what the writer is trying to get everything that they think they want to know about, have struggled with, into one book, and then as they get into the later career in the next books, you'll get a big book that's just on this one thing. And it's because they've refined their thoughts and how to write about it and how to expand it. So yes, I mean, the broken relationships, faulty relationships, miscommunications, the breakdown in trust or keeping secrets. These are the hearts at the heart of everything from your last failed relationship to the next giant war we'll probably fight.
I think it goes back to that whole empathetic connection,
Yeah.
too. That's interesting. Lots to think about.
Jason, thank
Yes.
you so much for being here today. I hope you had fun.
Well, and before we
And-
go, let's
oh.
talk about Jason's recommended reads. If he thinks that, well, talk about them. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, Sarah and Racine asked me to come up with some recommended reads, some likes or related topics. And if you want, there is a suggested reading list on my website. It's jquinmalott.com. And it's just a bunch of nonfiction stuff that I ended up reading as part of my research about the war, if you're interested in that. And when I was writing the early draft of this novel in graduate school, my best friend and roommate during graduate school referred to it as Snow Falling on the English Patient, because those were two of the more influential novels on my development as a writer. So, of course, one of our recommends will be David Gutterson's Snow Falling on Cedars, which is similar to my book in that it's about an interracial relationship between a Japanese woman and an American man right at the cusp of World War II.
I can held on to it.
And then the other one is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, which is perhaps one of my favorite books of all time. And as all they will tell you, some writers plagiarize, great writers steal everything. And this was the book that I stole from the most, as far as learning how to structure a novel and pace it, and the fragmented episodic way that my book develops was totally stolen from Ondaatje.
I think we said borrowed permanently.
It's permanent. That's
Influence. I would say influence,
Okay,
because
good.
really,
Okay.
they're
Just
both
trying to-
great work, so, okay.
And then, if you're interested in another work of fiction about the Bosnian War, there's Sasha Stanek's How the Soldier Repairs the Gramophone. It's more in the magical realism type, so it's quite entertaining. I have not read it myself, but it was mentioned and reviewed along with Well, it was mentioned in my favorite review of my book, as part of the suite of Bosnian novels that were coming out at about the same time and a must-read. So it's on my list, but I've got tired of reading about the Bosnian War at some
So
point.
it's probably good to take a break from,
Yes.
from such a heavy topic. Well, great, wonderful. We have all of these books available for checkout. We also have Jason's book available for checkout if you didn't get a chance to read it. But maybe our conversation today made you really, really interested in reading this book, because you know what, it was really good. So I will
Well,
say.
and I think this segs perfectly into our adult winter reading program,
Oh, yeah, good point.
Read More, Live More, where this time around, it's each time you read a different book, you're living a different life. So
Hey, empathy.
empathy,
Reading about other people's
empathy
lives.
rocks.
We
I
love empathy.
Oh gosh.
Jinx.
All right, so next time for ICTBC, for the online book club, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about
We're
2
gonna
or
book
3
talk.
different books, and she'll bring up some books and I'll bring up some books. It's the day after Valentine's Day on the 15th of February, and that's at 12:30 like normal, so please join us.
And you know what? If you want, then you can bring some books that you are reading,
Yes.
maybe, and we'll have a whole thread of book recommendations about Read More, Live More. How's that sound?
That sounds excellent. I was just elbowing Jason. Jason,
Make some
make with the titles.
All right, well, thank you, Jason, again for joining us, and I hope to see you all next month. Please continue the conversation in the comments. Have a great day.